The heavy rain pounded against the windows as a sudden knock echoed through the house. Opening the door, she froze in complete disbelief. Carl stood there, drenched and unexpected. "See, Carl. What on earth are you doing here?" she gasped, her heart racing as his presence sent an absolute shock through her. Meanwhile, miles away under the dark, rainy sky, her husband stood outside, staring at a distant building. A relentless suspicion had been plaguing his mind for weeks, eating away at him. He whispered to himself in the cold night, "A secret. Her, with him. I just knew it." Back at the house, Carl tried to push his way inside, his expression intense and demanding. "He isn't home." "I made sure of that," Carl asserted coldly. Terrified of what might happen next, she held onto the door, pleading, "Please, you must leave. He could be back at any second." The panic escalated when another sound came from the hallway. It was her husband, returning much earlier than expected. Panicking, she rushed Carl into the shadows, whispering desperately, "He's in the hallway. Into the closet. Get in, quickly." She was hiding the only man she really loved, trying to prevent a disastrous collision. The husband stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space with deep mistrust. From behind the closet door, Carl watched his every move through a narrow crack, barely breathing. She stood paralyzed with fear, knowing her husband was working late but had returned out of suspicion. Her lover was concealed, but the tension was suffocating. Cut to the husband's office or his thoughts from earlier that evening, where he had been burying himself in paperwork. He thought his secret investigation was safe, completely unaware that his wife's heart was already with another man, and that his sudden return had just trapped them all in a dangerous game. The suffocating silence inside the master bedroom was reaching a terrifying breaking point, filling the dark space with an unbearable pressure. Her husband sat rigidly at his heavy oak desk, the pale green light of the desk lamp casting long, distorted shadows across his face and the walls. His fingers, slow and deliberate, began to turn the crisp pages of the secret investigation file. Every single rustle of that paper sounded like a deafening gunshot in her ears, making her heart violently leap inside her chest. She stood completely frozen near the edge of the bed, her hands clenched so tightly together that her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting frantically between the back of her husband's head and the narrow vertical crack of the closet door. Inside the pitch-black darkness of the closet, Carl could feel a cold, thick sweat dripping down his neck and freezing against his skin. His legs were beginning to cramp painfully from standing in the exact same rigid position for so long, but he knew with absolute certainty that moving even a fraction of an inch would cause the old, warped wooden floorboards beneath his feet to creak loudly and betray him. The husband suddenly stopped turning the pages, his hand hovering over the paper. He stared intensely at a specific photograph inside the folder, which was a clear surveillance picture of Carl taken from behind. A heavy, dreadful silence stretched over the room for what felt like an eternity. Then, the husband let out a low, humorless chuckle that vibrated through the quiet room and made her blood run completely cold. It was the terrifying sound of a hunter who knew he held all the cards, a man who chose to play with his trapped prey before delivering the final strike. Slowly, he closed the folder with a heavy, echoing thud, stood up, and took off his wet, heavy coat. He casually threw it onto the wooden chair positioned right next to the closet door. Carl closed his eyes in pure terror inside the dark, biting his lip to keep from screaming as the damp fabric of the coat brushed heavily against the outside of the closet door, just inches away from his face. Her husband stood up from the desk and slowly turned around to face her, his tall figure dominating the dimly lit room. His expression was completely calm and unreadable, like a smooth sheet of ice, but his eyes were incredibly sharp, piercing through the shadows and searching her pale face for any hidden sign of guilt or panic. He began to walk toward her with slow, measured, and heavy footsteps that seemed to echo directly inside her chest. "You seem unusually quiet and distant tonight," he said, his voice smooth and quiet but laced with a dangerous, sharp undertone that made her shiver. "Is everything all right here, or is there something weighing on your mind that you are not telling me?" She forced herself to take a deep, trembling breath, desperately trying to control the muscles in her face and keep her voice from cracking under the immense pressure. Of course, honey, everything is perfectly fine, she replied, forcing a weak, artificial smile onto her lips while her heart hammered frantically. I was just incredibly surprised to see you come back home so early tonight. The storm outside looks absolutely terrible, and I thought your meetings would keep you trapped across town until tomorrow morning. Her husband nodded his head very slowly, his eyes never leaving hers as he walked right past her, brushing his shoulder against hers, and stopped at the side of the bed. Yes, the storm outside is indeed getting worse, but some urgent matters simply cannot wait for the morning, he murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper. I realized tonight that running away from a problem or ignoring a hidden truth does not make it disappear. It is always much better to face the situation head-on and expose what is hidden in the dark. Do you not agree with me? He turned his head and looked directly into her eyes, but then, with agonizing slowness, his gaze shifted away from her face and landed directly on the brass handle of the closet door. She felt her breath trap in her throat and her heart completely stop for a second. Did he already know the truth, or was he just playing a sick, psychological game to break her sanity? Before she could even gather enough strength to answer his terrifying question, her husband turned his back to her and began walking with direct, purposeful steps straight toward the massive wooden closet. I think I need to immediately change out of these damp, uncomfortable clothes before I catch a cold, he muttered casually, reaching his right hand out through the shadows toward the cold brass handle of the closet door. Inside the heavy darkness of the closet, Carl clenched his fists so hard that his fingernails dug deep into his palms, his chest heaving as his heart hammered wildly like a trapped animal. Carl knew with absolute certainty that the very moment that door swung open, there would be no room for explanations, no valid excuses, and absolutely no way to escape the husband's wrath. He braced his entire body, preparing himself for an immediate, violent explosion that would change everything forever. In that split second, pure, unadulterated panic seized her entire being, screaming at her that she had to do something drastic right now to break his focus. Without a single thought for the consequences, she reached out, grabbed a heavy, ornamental glass vase from the bedside table, and violently knocked it off the edge. The heavy vase crashed onto the hard floorboards with a loud, shattering explosion, sending hundreds of sharp, glittering glass shards flying across the room. Her husband stopped instantly, his hand freezing just a mere inch away from the closet handle. He turned his head sharply toward the sound, his dark eyebrows furrowing into a deep, angry frown as he stared at the destruction on the floor. What on earth was that? He demanded loudly, stepping completely away from the closet door and walking directly toward her with a cold, angry intensity. I am so incredibly sorry, she lied instantly, her voice trembling and shaking with genuine fear as she quickly knelt down on the hard floor, pretending to frantically gather the broken pieces of glass to hide her panic. My hands are just shaking so badly because of the freezing cold in this room, and I am being so clumsy and careless tonight. Please let me clean all of this up right now before anyone accidentally steps on a sharp piece and gets hurt. Her husband walked over and stood directly over her kneeling body, looking down at her with a heavy, suffocating mixture of deep suspicion and growing irritation. He watched her movements with a predatory silence, observing how her fingers were trembling so violently that she actually cut her skin on a sharp edge, causing a small drop of bright red blood to stain the floorboard, but she was far too terrified of the closet door to even notice the physical pain. He did not move a muscle to help her. Instead, he just stood there like a shadow, studying the way she breathed, as if he were trying to read the desperate, hidden thoughts racing through her mind. The desperate distraction had worked to pull him away from the door for now, but she knew in her heart that she had only bought themselves a few fleeting minutes of safety. Carl was still completely trapped inside that dark closet, unable to move, and her husband clearly had no intention of leaving the master bedroom anytime soon. The air in the room felt incredibly thick, hot, and completely suffocating, exactly like the heavy atmosphere that builds up right before a massive, destructive lightning strike hits the ground. Her husband let out a long, deep sigh that seemed to carry a heavy weight of exhaustion and hidden anger, finally looking away from her and checking the glowing face of his watch. It is getting incredibly late, and the night is passing by, he said in a cold, detached voice that offered no comfort. I still have an immense amount of complicated legal work and files to finish before tomorrow morning arrives, and I find it completely impossible to concentrate or think clearly in this messy room right now. Just leave the broken glass on the floor, the maid can easily clean it up when she arrives in the morning. Go to bed and get some sleep. He walked back over to his desk, picked up the heavy manila folder filled with his investigation notes, and began walking directly toward the bedroom door. But just as he turned the handle and pushed the door open into the dark hallway, he stopped completely in his tracks and looked back at her over his shoulder one last time. Make sure you lock the bedroom door securely behind me tonight, he said, a strange, dark, and knowing smile creeping onto his face that made her spine shiver. You never truly know who might try to secretly sneak into a house on a wild, stormy night like this. With those final, chilling words that sounded like a hidden warning, he stepped out into the corridor and closed the heavy door behind him. She listened intently as the sound of his heavy footsteps slowly faded away down the stairs. The absolute moment the sound died down completely, her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as if she had been held underwater for a lifetime. She scrambled to her feet, rushed over to the heavy bedroom door, and quietly turned the lock, ensuring with absolute certainty that her husband could not walk back into the room unexpectedly. Then, she turned around, ran across the room to the closet, and pulled the wooden door open with a frantic jerk. Carl stumbled out of the darkness, coughing and gasping for breath, his face completely pale and drenched in a thick sweat of pure terror. We have to leave this house right now, there is no time left, Carl whispered frantically in a ragged voice, grabbing her trembling hand with a tight, desperate grip. He knows everything. I could see it clearly in his eyes when he looked toward the closet through that tiny crack. He knows exactly that I am hiding in here, and he is just playing a cruel, psychological game with both of us to torture us. She looked into Carl's eyes, the overwhelming terror in her heart suddenly hardening into a cold, desperate realization of their situation. If they tried to run out through the front door right now, her husband would easily hear them and catch them red-handed in the narrow hallway. But if they chose to stay hidden in this room, they were just waiting to be trapped like rats in a cage. Outside, the furious storm finally reached its violent peak, a massive, brilliant flash of lightning illuminating the entire bedroom in a ghostly white light, followed instantly by a deafening, house-shaking roar of thunder. And then, through the sudden silence that followed, they heard it from downstairs, the distinct, sharp click of the study room door opening once again. The game was far from over. Her husband was already coming back up the stairs, and this time, his heavy footsteps told them he was not coming back up empty-handed.